Let's work on the flying geese blocks of our Pumpkins and Potions quilt. It's time to work on our first piece blocks of the quilt, the flying geese on page 49. I will be making 2 blocks, one for section 1 that we're working on now, the other is for section 5. I have the batting for each block, and these are the material pieces that do not have interfacing on the back. Once they are complete and pieced in the hoop, we will do the background quilting. Let's get started. For the flying geese blocks, they will be a little bit different than the previous blocks. They will be pieced in the hoop, and after they are finished, then the background quilting will be added. I will put 2 blocks in one hoop, however, I will stitch them out one at a time. I will bring in the background quilting and the flying geese template. I can go to the Merge Stitch File icon on the top right, but the way I like to bring files in is to go to the folder that I keep all of my files for the Pumpkins and Potions quilt. I will first bring in the background quilting, so I will open the Quilting Bundles folder. The first flying geese will have a background quilting of Halloween 10, so I will open that folder, and I need to find the 4x6 size. I will drag and drop it into the hoop, and it will be automatically centered. Now I will go back to the Embroidery Files folder, and I will bring in the flying geese template, and I will drag and drop that, and it will also be centered in the hoop. There are a few changes I need to make to the background quilting design. I will come to the steps on the right hand side and open up that first step. Now the first step of the background quilting is the placement line for the batting, and I do need that step. The second step is the tack down of the batting, and normally on my batting I have it cut to size, and so I do not need this step because my batting is cut to this exact size, and so the tack down line doesn't really do any good. But in the case of these blocks, I am going to do the batting the traditional way, where I will cut it larger. I will run the tack down stitch, and then I will trim the batting all around. So I do need to keep this step for the flying geese. The third step in the quilting is the placement line for the fabric. And this is a step that I do not need because the flying geese template has a tack down stitch that comes later, and it will be this exact size. So I am going to select that, and I am going to hit delete on my keyboard. Then I have the tack down of the fabric. Normally I do need that, but with these flying geese, the template also has that included. So I also will delete that step. Now the last thing that I'm going to do is change where the background quilting falls. Right now, if I take this design to my machine, it will run the first 2 steps, and then it will want to run the background quilting. Of course, this needs to be our very last step after all of these steps for the flying geese have been finished. So I could take it to my machine, and when I get to this third step, I could just skip and go on to the template and finish the whole flying geese, and then use the keys that I used to skip, use the back key, and get back to the background quilting. That's an easy way, and there's nothing wrong with doing it that way. However, since I'm in software, I'm going to go ahead and make the changes so that it's actually where I need it and not have to skip any steps. I will select this background quilting. I will Command C on my Mac to copy, and then I will Command V to paste, and that will paste just the background quilting and not the placement or the tack down of that step. But I need to select the first background quilting that I copied, and I need to hit delete on my keyboard to delete that. So now the background quilting is the very last step, which is what we need it to be. So if I go to the Stitch Simulator, this block starts off with the placement for the batting, and then I would lay the batting down and run the tack down of the batting and then trim it. Then it will run the template for the flying geese. Then are all the flying geese pieces that go on, and then it's hard to see because it's the same color, but it will run that outside gray box. It will run the tack down, and then finally at the very end, when the block is done, it will run the quilting. And that's exactly what I want it to do. Now, in order to fit 2 of the flying geese blocks into one hoop, I do need to change my hoop size. Right now it's on the 6x10, so I will come to the Preferences folder, and I am going to choose the 7x12. Then I will come to the compass, select H, and that will put the whole hoop onto my screen. Now I need to select all of the designs. On my Mac, I will hit Command A, and that will select everything on my screen. Then I will come to the Rotate Left and rotate the block. I will use my arrow key and move it up a little bit. Now I will follow these same steps to make the second flying geese block. However, I will use a different background quilting. I will be using Halloween 11 in the 4x6 horizontal. Now I need to select the second flying geese block. I cannot Command A or that will select everything. So I can either drag a selection box just over that new block. I can also come to the right hand side where the steps are listed, and I can select the first, hold my shift key down and select the last. That will select all 3 steps of that block. Then I will come to the Rotate Left, and using my arrow key, I will move the block down. I want to bring it as far down as I can. I'm going to reselect this top block and move it up all the way to the top. That's why I use the compass to bring the whole hoop into the design screen. When I put these on my machine, I need as much space between the blocks as possible. Now I need to save my file by going to File, Save Stitch File As. I will be putting it into my Pumpkins and Potions folder, and inside that folder I have a file called Combined Files. Anytime I merge or change or edit any files, I always add them to this folder. I will name my design. And I will save it, and then I will add it to my USB to take to my machine. When I did the start of these flying geese, I cut my batting to size like I do on all my blocks. And then I decided that I am going to do the batting the traditional way by cutting it larger and tacking the batting down, which is something that I normally do not do. And the reason I decided to do this is because the template for the flying geese will go over the batting. And so I want to go ahead and tack that down so that that stitch does not pull up the batting. Now we don't really need this entire template stitched out. You could stitch out the first part and just know where that first piece of the flying geese goes, but I'm going to go ahead and run the whole thing. So let's get started. I will go to embroidery and to my USB, and I will go to my combined files folder. I will pull up the flying geese that I combined in software and hit set and embroidery. I am going to move this design to the left because remember I have a 7x12 and my machine is set for an 8x12. Now I am going to do these flying geese separate. They are not color sorted, so I will be doing this top one first. So let's stitch out the placement for the batting. I stitched out the placement for the batting, and I have a piece of extra that I saved when I usually cut my batting, and I am just going to make sure that it is covering all of the stitching. And this is what you would do if you are doing the traditional way where your batting is cut larger. So we will stitch the tack down of the batting. Now I'm going to cut around right next to the stitch line around the whole batting. But you can see that I left this at regular speed, so you can see how much time I save by cutting my batting to size. I'll get this trimmed up and we'll keep going. Now this is what your batting will look like after you've tacked it down and trimmed it. We'll continue by stitching out the flying geese template. While this is stitching out, you can see that this first triangle is really the only part of the template that we need. And I could have just done my batting as normal, cutting it exactly to size and stitching out that first triangle, and then I wouldn't be stitching along the batting. You can also see it stitched out this outer placement line, and that is something that, again, we didn't really need with the template because it's going to do that whole stitch again. But this is what the template looks like if you stitch the whole template out and do everything according to the instructions. second flying geese, I am going to go ahead and use the batting that I cut to size. I ran the placement and then I put my batting down. This is the tack down of the batting that we did for the first one, but I am going to skip that. So I'm going to hit this down arrow, and now it's going to do the template. But because I cut my batting to size, I really don't want it to go around the whole piece of batting, and that's what I normally skip on the other blocks. So I am going to start the template and let it stitch out that first little triangle, and then I'm going to stop my machine and go to the next step. Because all we really need is that first triangle. Once that's placed, then the other steps are stitched out and we don't really need the template that's on the batting. Now I will come back over to my steps. Since I finished that first little triangle, it still, of course, thinks it needs to finish the whole template. So I am going to go to this down arrow and skip to the next step. So now we're ready to do the placement. And we'll continue exactly the same way as we did the other one. Sure if I pointed this out before, but the placement line, when you put your fabric, you need to make sure that it's centered over that line, so you have a little bit on this side and a little bit on this side. Another thing I do different is the directions say to line up the edge of this fabric just underneath this line. I put mine a little bit farther over, so my seam allowance is going to be a little bit larger than 1/4 inch. But I do that so that the black doesn't possibly show through, since I didn't back these, especially on this white fabric. It probably wouldn't matter too much on the orange. But I put mine a little bit over, so I have a little bit larger of a seam allowance right there. Let me show it again on this side. So the fabric, you want a little bit hanging off the edge of the placement line. Here's the edge of this side. So you want this piece centered. The directions say to line up your fabric with that sewing line. But again, I don't want this black to shadow through, so I am just moving mine past that line, which is why I end up with more than a 1/4 inch seam allowance. This a little bit with the last block, which was Ghost 1, but now we have this situation again where the background quilting is a design that gets stitched into the seam allowance just because of the way it's stitched out. So if you can see on this Flying Geese block, here is the fabric tack down, and here is the stitching that goes into the seam allowance. Let me turn it on the back. So here is the fabric tack down. We usually have been taking this stitching out and then cutting next to the batting, which is this stitch line. But you can see that there is a stitch line in the middle, which is from the quilting. So when this happens, there is a little bit between this and this, a little 1/8 of an inch stabilizer that will be in the seam. Sometimes it's maybe not even worth trimming to that. You could just take the block as is with the stabilizer and just cut it. It's so minimal. And then the stabilizer will be in the seam, but some is going to be in the seam no matter what we do. So that would be just a personal choice if you want to take this out and then trim the stabilizer. But that's what happens on some of the quilting backgrounds, where just the way it quilts out, it needs to run down into the seam allowance to stitch out. So for me, I think I am just going to cut and not worry about trimming the stabilizer this time. Hopefully the block next to it will have all the stabilizer trimmed out of the seam allowance. But this time I am not going to worry about that. So I am going to place my ruler. And remember, this outside white thread is the trim line. So I just want to make sure I have as even as possible. It does pull in. It does sometimes pull in just a tiny bit from the quilting, and that's why you can't always just say use a regular ruler and cut. It's probably so minimal that it might not make a difference, but always double check and get the best cut for the finished size that you can. So here's our flying geese block. You can see from the back we do have a little bit of stabilizer, but I think that's going to be okay. We don't have, of course, batting in the seams, and that's the most important. So let me get this other one cut. I do want to show on this one, even though I pressed it, it is a little bit, it did pull in a little bit more than the other one. So I'm going to zoom in. I've got the top lined up with the cut line and the sides, but I want to show you that if I were just to cut along the seam line, put this back, look how much shorter I am. So if I were to cut just along the seam line, let's say I didn't have the orange pop rulers and I was just using a regular ruler to cut along this, this is why you can't go always just by the stitching line. Even though that's supposed to be the correct, it kind of bunched in when I did the quilting, and so this would be quite a major difference. So that's why if I were to cut this with the regular ruler and I didn't have the orange pop ruler, what I would do is I would probably cut on the top stitching line and along the side stitching line of this block. Let me do that again. I would cut on the top stitching line and the side, and before I cut the bottom and the other side, I would measure to make sure that the block is the 4.5 by 6.5 that it needs to be. Because if I were, again, just to cut along this line, I would be at least an 1/8, if not even a little bit, probably a little bit more short. And that will mess up when I go to sew a section together. So always double check your finished size before cutting. So I've just cut this side, and I've decided that I am going to move this ruler up just a little bit so that this isn't quite as big on the bottom. I want to make sure that that stitching doesn't show when I do my 1/4 inch seam. So if I have a little bit to the inside and a little bit to the inside, then I'll be good as far as my sewing together. I hope that makes sense.